Fort George, headquarters of the Black Watch, the 3rd Battalion of the Royal Regiment of Scotland. The day begins, as it always does, to the sound of the bagpipes. For 300 years, in peace and in war, the pipes have punctuated the lives of Scottish soldiers. Tunes of glory, of inspiration, and of remembrance. Today, the Army Piper has a role rich in history and pageantry. But 100 years ago, the Army Piper had a role simply beyond belief. In the Great War, pipers would rise, unarmed from the trenches, in defiance of machine guns and shells, in defiance of any notion of self-preservation. They would stand straight and play their comrades into battle. More than 2,500 pipers served. Almost half were killed or wounded. Men from Scottish battalions raised all across Britain and her empire. Men of inconceivable bravery. The pipers of the trenches. The seaside town of Blythe, 15 miles north of Newcastle.
I haven't seen these since I was tiny.
Katie Hall and her grandfather, John Wilson, have family ties dating back to the Great War Pipers of the Tyneside Scottish Regiment.
It's amazing to think that they were the pipes that your dad played during the war. It's different. I'll pop that bit there, man.
Katie's great-grandfather, also called John Wilson, played these very pipes onto the battlefield on the first day of the Somme. The bloodiest single day in British military history.
My granddad's father was a pipe major and his father was a pipe major, obviously during the war. And my granddad's father's brothers were also pipe majors as well.
That's the mouthpiece.
That's your mouthpiece.
That's a chanter.
It was just kind of one of those family things to do. It was important to them. You know, it was a big part of their life, so.
3 of Katie's ancestors played at the Somme, and Katie's become fascinated with their individual stories.
When I was probably about 12, I noticed a briefcase at my granddad's house, at my grandparents', and it was just full of old things. I was fascinated. It was old photographs, old documents, old newspaper articles. And there's your granddad again.
That's right.
Yeah, he's definitely playing the pipes on that one, isn't he? You know, you feel like you know them, even though they were there way beyond your years.
Katie has studied her family history for years, but one ambition remains.
I would love to visit France, visit the battlefield where everything took place. Somebody to be able to show me what the pipers actually did there. Knowing that ancestors were there, you know, just to get an idea of what went on.
From the beginning of the war in July 1914 to its end in November 1918, over 5 million men served in the British Army. Hundreds of battalions, of which around 1 in 7 belong to the Scottish tradition. Some with kilts, but all with pipers.
They are there to perform the traditional role of a piper in a Scottish regiment, playing on the march and playing duty tunes during the day, but ultimately there is the idea that in battle they will play to encourage the men forward. As a new piper in a new army battalion, you were entering a well-established tradition that on the one hand you would look back to the kind of well-known musicians and composers, because there is a very strong tradition of that in the Scottish Regiment as well, but also looking back to the tradition of playing in battle and being wounded in battle, which is not something new. It's not something that started happening in the First World War. This goes back. The famous ones would be Piper Clark at Wimmera in 1808 in the Peninsular War against the French. The wounded piper plays on. In 1898, the Northwest Frontier of India, the Heights of Dargai, which is a famous pipe tune as well. Piper Finlatha, Gordon Highlanders, wounded, carries on playing. It's something that everyone would have known about.
The new Scottish regiments first came to the battlefields of France in the spring and summer of 1915. Their first major battle took place in the flat farmland surrounding the little mining town of Lewes.
There are huge numbers of Scots. I mean, this is the particular thing about the Battle of Lewes. You had 2 Scottish divisions in the assault on the first day, but also Scottish battalions throughout all the other divisions. So the estimate is there's something like 30,000 Scotsmen on the field of battle at Lewes.
And from that battlefield would emerge a truly legendary figure, a Scottish military icon, the Piper of Lewes. Kevin Laidlaw's great-grandfather, Piper Daniel Laidlaw, was perhaps the most famous Scottish soldier of the First World War. And Kevin's come back to the National Museum of Scotland to renew his acquaintance with his great-grandfather's most prized possession, his Victoria Cross, Britain's highest military honour.
One of 2 Victoria Cross awards to pipers during the First World War, only 2, and the other one was to a Canadian. That was in Canada, so when you and your family decided that you wanted to donate the medals to the National Collection, I mean, that was I think the expression was, we bit your hand off.
The story of how Piper Laidlaw won his medal ranks among the most celebrated stories of Scottish military history. It begins on the morning of the 25th of September 1915, with the first ever use of poison gas by the British Army.
The gas was released from cylinders for about 20 minutes, half an hour. But the critical thing here was that the weather changed. So the gas, instead of going out to the battlefield, it was actually coming back into the trenches and gassing the Allied soldiers. And in those days, you can imagine they'd have very primitive gas masks. And also, you can imagine nobody wanted to go over the top, so the line didn't move.
Kevin's great-grandfather appeared as himself in the 1928 film, The Guns of Lewes, recreating the events of that day.
Lieutenant Young shouted, you know, for God's sake, Laidlaw, do something. So he struck up his pipes, went over the top playing Blue Bonnets all over the border, the regimental march of the King's Own Scottish Borders, the battalion he was attached to. And it was only then that the line started to move and the men went over the top. He played until he was shot in the legs and actually managed to get back to the trench. But the men actually captured Lewes that day and made some significant advances.
With men falling all around us in the trenches.
In a filmed interview from 1934, Piper Laidlaw gave his own account of the day to military historian Sir John Hamerton.
It gives me a thrill to find you have brought the famous pipes of Lewes with you, Laidlaw.
Never go anywhere without them, sir. I played them over the top and went right on through the first line of German trenches, on to the second line where I was bowled over.
Will you play us the tune with which you pipe the boys over the top?
Yes, sir.
Laidlaw's tune, All the Blue Bonnets Are Over the Border, was written in the 18th century to celebrate the Jacobite uprising. But after Lewes, this tune of ancient rebellion would be forever associated with one man's act of bravery.
Every time I play it, you know, I just think of Piper Laidlaw and the exploits and all the men that went over the top that day. And coming to the museum today and seeing the medals, again, just kind of brings that all back. And it does make me feel quite proud to have a relative who was awarded the Victoria Cross in such a Scottish way. I feel like here's a piper doing what pipers are supposed to do, lead the men into battle. But also it's an insight into the horrors that was World War I, so it makes you really think about that as well.
Laidlaw was one of around 200 pipers who played at the Battle of Lewes. And of that 200, around 50 were killed.
There were many, many acts of gallantry, and Piper Laidlaw's courage is not in question here, but I think it was symbolic. I think, you know, there were numbers of pipers killed, but I think the idea of the wounded piper playing on, having that resonance in the Scottish tradition, that's what made it something that people kind of latched onto. Even more than other Victoria Cross winners, he became a symbol of something.
And the British were not alone in using the powerful image of the unarmed piper storming into battle.
Here's something else from 1915. This is a German commemorative medal. It's a very, very different image. This is a Scottish piper as the figure of death. You can see the death's head, the skull there. You see different versions of this kind of motif of the Dance of Death, but it is interesting that in 1915, one of the images that the artist here chooses is a Scottish piper. And I think that's got something to do with the German awareness of the Scottish presence at Lewes and the casualties that had been inflicted.
In the summer of 1916, a year after Lewes, the Allies again attempted to break the stalemate in northern France with the biggest British military operation of this or any other war, the Battle of the Somme. On the first day of the Somme, the 1st of July 1916, 20,000 British soldiers lost their lives. And in the epicenter of the battle, around the village of La Boiselle, the men of the Tyneside Scottish and Tyneside Irish were piped towards the German guns. Among the pipers were 3 of Katie Hall's ancestors. And for Katie, this is her first visit to the battlefield.
I really don't know what to expect, to be honest. As I said, it's something that you kind of read about in books or you watch movies about, but it's not something that you generally have an opportunity to experience. You know, it's not going to be until I actually stand there and see it for myself that I will know.
Katie's great-grandfather, his father, and his uncle all played the pipes into battle on these French fields.
You're standing right in the middle of the Somme battlefield here. The battlefield itself was 25 miles long, and you had almost 750,000 men waiting to attack on the 1st of July. It was the biggest battle that's ever been fought in British military history. And you're pretty well on the front lines here, where your great-uncle and great-grandfather would have served. The Tyneside Scottish attacked across this valley and the one on the far side of Lambersale.
Okay.
Behind them you had the Tyneside Irish, who attacked over the tops of these hills. But of course when they appeared over the top of the hill, the Irish, they became silhouetted against the sky.
Right.
Perfect targets. The German front line is where those houses were.
Right.
So that's the distance they had to cross here at
Huge,
walking
isn't it?
pace, in the sunshine,
Yeah.
under machine gun fire and artillery fire.
You can't even imagine. I can't even imagine what it would have been like.
Well, I spent my entire life studying this and I can't imagine it.
No. You
No,
really
I couldn't
can't.
even imagine 1 second of being here, having to get out of a trench, even if you are exhorted by pipers.
My great granddad, he went from one end to the other completely unscathed, but his uncle was shot several times, pretty much immediately. So I can't get to grips with the fact that they were both there at the same time, yet one of them was completely unharmed and the other one wasn't. And obviously they would have been both at the front.
They would have been standing in a trench, a very deep trench,
Yeah.
waiting for the whistle to blow. We don't know when the pipes would have started, but they would have started probably before the attack in
Yeah.
order to get the
ready,
blood
yeah.
charge,
Yeah.
really, because these men had to go and do things which they would doesn't come easily to a human
No,
being.
definitely not,
They had to
no.
kill in any way possible to
Yeah.
terrorise those men
Yeah.
into submission. For the Germans, as they got closer, the pipers were as important as knocking over an officer. If you
Yeah,
take
yeah.
out the officers, you take out the command sequence. If you take
Right.
out the piper, you take out something else, something
Yeah.
spiritual
Yeah.
almost. They would have become a target
Targets.
as well.
Yeah.
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 It's difficult to overestimate the importance of the pipers.
Yeah.
To kindle that collective spirit, the regimental spirit, and that's
Yeah.
what that's after the
That's what
brigadier
pipers
had
did.
said all his speech. It was up to it was
pipers
the
to do
sound
it.
of the pipes,
Yeah.
and as long as that piper could be heard amongst the crashes and explosions, still piping
Yeah.
across no man's land, that pulled people forward. Tremendous power in that
It just-
sound.
On that first day of the Somme, the noise was quite literally deafening. 1,500 British artillery pieces fired 250,000 shells. Underground explosions could be heard in England. There are no known audio recordings of the Great War, so could the latest technology, combined with meticulous research, build an accurate audio picture? To discover how the bagpipes might have sounded against the backdrop of Britain's biggest ever battle.
Sounds a little bright, so we can just take some of the high frequencies out of that,
Yes.
which will give us a distinct impression of...
First World War historian Michael Stedman has come to the digital design studio at the Glasgow School of Art.
I'm just wondering whether or not in the sort of, the first part of this,
Yeah.
we could actually have the sounds of artillery even
Sooner.
sooner. Well, the principal thing that every historian is concerned with is making sure that we're talking about veracity and accuracy. This is what we want. So I've referred to a number of sources, principally the Battalion War Diary or Intelligence Summary. I've also referred to the official histories, primary sources principally, or eyewitness accounts written and compiled by people who were there.
People moving around.
Michael has studied all the weaponry deployed at the Somme, when exactly it was used, and how exactly it sounded.
I think we're talking about Stokes mortar bomb.
Yeah, okay.
And they produced a rather sort of bass, flat,
Thudding sound.
yes. A bit more drawn out.
Drawn
than
out,
that.
okay, I'll see.
I have a mental image of what I'm going to hear, but at the moment I'm just desperately looking forward to hearing what this is going to sound like.
After you, Michael.
Thanks very much, Paul. I mean, that actually hurts. It is just, it's painfully real.
Paul had placed the sound of a lone piper in the mix. But amidst the hellish cacophony of the first day of the Somme, it was almost impossible to hear.
Throughout this, the pipes appear. I'll play you the pipes, this section now, and you can tell me if you hear the pipes. Now you're aware that they are there, and there should be about 5 seconds or so before these pipes come in. Well, they are there. I'm just soloing the track, just quite close, quite loud.
At its height, the intensity and scale of the battle would have obscured the sound of the pipes.
Shells, huge shells landing close by, machine gun fire. The bullets hitting metal objects, shredding people, shredding wood. The pipes become indiscernible.
On that first day of the Somme, soldiers might well have lost contact with the sound of the pipes. But what remained was the sight of the piper, walking forward, unarmed, into the hell of battle.
Horrible. That's awful.
It's the legacy of all this which these men have got to cope with. Even those who were not wounded, like your great-granddad who got through the war unwounded, what was he carrying with him for the rest of his life? What visions did he see every single day of his life as a result of this one day?
It's horrible. That's awful.
Three of Katie's ancestors played at the Somme. 2 survived. Her great-uncle, Garnet Wolseley Fife, was killed on the first day.
Lance Corporal Garnet Wolseley, 23rd Tyneside Scottish Battalion, Northumberland Fusiliers, 1st of July, 1916, aged 36, son of...
Born in Edinburgh, the youngest of 10 children, Garnet's family had moved to the northeast of England soon after the death of his father. And like his father, Garnet became a miner. And in 1906, he married a local girl, Rachel Burrows. They had one child, a boy, Ronald. Katie has long collected his letters and photographs, but this is her first visit to Garnet's grave.
I just knew that he was a miner. married, had a child, and was a piper. It's nice to be able to see it instead of just a photograph. It's lovely. Having photographs and documents and knowing where those people lived and what they did, and knowing that they never went back to it, you know, knowing that they had a normal life with children and family, to never go home to that, it's sad.
Four battalions of the Tyneside Scottish had gone into battle, with 26 pipers, of whom 20 were killed or wounded, pipes in hand. And when the guns fell silent, pipers would write tunes in honour of the fallen comrades. The Battle of the Somme was one such tune. Perhaps the greatest pipe tune of the war. Composed by a lowly born Highland quarryman, Pipe Major Willie Lawrie.
Lovely tune. Willie Lawrie, his music has a very distinctive stamp. And it may be that that's because he came from the Gaelic community of Ballachulish in the west coast, that it has that link back into the musicality of Gaelic song. It is really the instrument of celebration in the clan chief's hall and so forth, or the villages in the countryside. I don't think the outside world is perhaps conscious of how special that relationship between the bagpipe and the Highlands is.
The Highland pipers of the Great War, men like Willie Lawrie, were a connection to what had been left behind. To home, to family, and to better times. Grigor Lawrie is a descendant of Willie Lawrie and a student of his life and work.
He was very aware of his position in the army as someone who was able to give the guys who must have been very, very low in spirit and missing home so much a wee bit of heart and a wee bit of home while they were away. And there were other boys here from Ballachulish with him, and I think they really all stuck together, and he and his music were a big part of that.
Lawrie spent a year in the trenches. In action at Ypres and Festubert. He died in November 1916. Killed not by bullets or bombs, but by an infection. A victim of the squalor and filth of the Great War.
It was a very sad thing for everybody in the village and beyond. He was recognised nationally as a treasure musically, you know. He'd gone on to live until old age. Think about the music that he could have produced.
In what was the First World War, pipers played far beyond the trenches of northern France. Glasgow drama teacher Richie McCone has come to Western Turkey with Stuart Allen of the National Museum of Scotland. Richie hopes to uncover the story of his great-grandfather, Piper Kenneth MacLennan, an almost forgotten ancestor.
He was up in the north of Scotland and he moved to Clydebank to work for Singer, I think. That's all I really know. I do know that he plays the bagpipes, or he piped, and I know that he piped in the war.
Military service records reveal that MacLennan enlisted in the Highland Light Infantry in the May of 1914. He was then 29 years old and gave his occupation as labourer. A year later, he left Glasgow and his wife Lizzie behind and boarded a troop ship headed for Gallipoli.
The opportunity to go over to Gallipoli to find out what happened over there would help me to really connect with the story and perhaps connect with my family history.
On the 5th of July 1915, Richie's great-grandfather landed on this very beach.
I think this is the remains of a monitor, a small boat that's part of the ferrying of men and supplies.
MacLennan's regiment, the 7th Highland Light Infantry, had come to reinforce the main British landings. All part of an ambitious and perilous Allied plan to establish a sea route to Russia.
They came in at night.
At night time?
Yeah, because it wasn't safe on the beach. I mean, the landings had taken place here in April, but the beaches were still a very dangerous place to be. The front line wasn't terribly far away. You know, and these guys had never been in action before. They're right into it, because as soon as you're on the beach, you're in danger of shell fire.
Piper MacLennan and the men of the Highland Light Infantry moved inland, a mile north of the beach. The conditions they found here, at the British rest camp, were squalid and diseased.
I mean, you see the ground here. It's very hard to dig in this soil. There would be thousands of men here sleeping in kind of scraped out holes, and if they were lucky, they had a waterproof cover over the top. And if you think about the kind of like the sanitation and everything that number of people in one place you had to deal with, and flies, all the accounts of people's experiences in Gallipoli, they talk about this plague of flies. So you've got dysentery and enteric fever. It's kind of constant.
What would a piper's role be here?
The piper's going through what everyone else is going through. Music in the rest camp, I guess, was an option, and the pipes might have played at certain times of day. But like the rest of them, he was essentially waiting to do his job, because his job was up there. The vineyard is where? The vineyard?
Yeah, this way.
Back that way.
Working with specialist guide Isit Yildirim, Stuart and Richie are attempting to find the Allied front line. Richie doesn't yet know that his great-grandfather, Piper MacLennan, would emerge from a battle in these Turkish fields as a decorated military hero.
So this is 12th of July now.
Right.
So he's been here for a couple of weeks. And this is the brigade going into the front for the second time.
And what happened?
Well, the objectives that they had been set was to capture 3 lines of Turkish trenches, which are just over there where we walked from. The problem was that the 3rd trench didn't actually exist. It was a mistake. There was something there, but it wasn't a properly dug out trench. So they went forward in waves, and the first wave, which your great-grandfather would have been in, was detailed to capture the 3rd trench. So the whistles blow and everyone gets up out of their trench, and your great-grandfather as a piper starts to play and plays the charge, and they move forward in that direction there into machine gun fire. And a lot of people were killed early on. It's a very confused picture, but they got across the 2 lines of trenches, and then they kept going for this 3rd trench.
That didn't
which
exist.
Didn't really exist.
Right.
So when they got to basically a succession of shell holes, they tried to hold it, but they couldn't. He kept playing the charge, people, I guess, falling and dying all around him, and he kept playing the charge until effectively, I think shrapnel burst blew the tops off his bagpipes.
Right.
So when he could play no more, he then reverted roles and started evacuating the wounded and bringing them back here to the British line. And for that,
so he just kept going back and forward
and bringing in the wounded. I mean, this was noticed in all the melee that was going on. So afterwards, he was recommended for a gallantry decoration, which he got. He was awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal for playing until he was able to play no longer, and then exposed to enemy fire, bringing his wounded comrades back. So he did pretty well.
He did do pretty well. That's pretty impressive. I didn't know that at all.
About half of the 7th HLI, about 500, were killed or wounded, but the other half made it through, and your great-grandfather was one of them. And the only, you know, it's quite depressing. I was kind of reading about exactly what happened here, and there's not a lot positive to draw from it, but the one kind of positive thing is actually the kind of resilience of and I guess the courage of the guys who had to do it.
Yeah.
And that's the one thing that comes out that you can take something from. There's not much else.
Mm. I think, see, after being told that, it's almost like I've got this sort of heroic, silhouetted figure. I just can't imagine the idea of everybody else is running about with guns, and this guy standing in the middle of a field with a set of bagpipes. I'm sure he was one of many young men who fought for their country, who bravely looked after and saved other people around them and took them back to the trenches to offer support and help, you know. So he's one of many, but I feel really proud to be a part of that one person.
Six months after Kenneth MacLennan piped his men into battle, the Allied forces withdrew. The Gallipoli campaign had been a total failure. In less than a year of fighting and disease, 500,000 men, both Turkish and Allied, were killed or wounded.
Huzur içinde uyuyunuz. Sizler Mehmetçiklerle yan yana koyun koyunasınız. Uzak diyarlardan evlatlarını harbe gönderen analar.
Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the founder of modern Turkey, had led the defense of Gallipoli. In poignant reconciliation, he wrote,
"You, the mothers who sent their sons from faraway countries, wipe away your tears. Your sons are now lying in our bosom and are in peace. After having lost their lives on this land, they have become our sons as well."
Some people there are 16 years old. You know, some of the people who fought here are the same age as the people I teach.
And back home in Scotland, on Glasgow Green, Ritchie has found a memorial to the men of the 7th Highland Light Infantry, and to the great-grandfather he's only just come to know.
Coming back and actually talking to my pupils about it, or talking to my colleagues about it and actually telling about it, some people actually felt quite sort of proud themselves and emotional at me speaking to them about what was going on. So
It made me think a lot more about my history and a lot more about my family's history. To be able to stand in the position that my great-grandfather was fighting, it's been a phenomenal experience.
A century after MacLennan's heroics at Gallipoli, the British Army continues to train its young soldiers in the art of piping. These volunteers have come from regiments near and far to the Army School of Pipes and Drums, just south of Edinburgh. Today, at the Passing Out Parade, they become pipers, part of a living military tradition. They follow in the footsteps of men like Laidlaw, Fife, Laurie and MacLennan. In today's wars, these soldiers may never leap from the trenches and play their pipes into battle. But the army retains its steadfast faith that the sound of the pipes can inspire soldiers into great and heroic achievements. So what would happen if science tested that faith?
So that's good. We're going to set you up.
Dr. Harry Witchell of the Brighton and Sussex Medical School has devised a unique experiment to find out if hearing the pipes could inspire soldiers to even greater feats of bravery and strength.
Today's experiment, we're going to be looking at the effects of different kinds of sounds on your ability to perform under various circumstances. So it's going to be slight fatigue on your strength. We're going to play you different kinds of sounds or music as the case may be. You'll be listening to something for about 5 minutes on the treadmill, and then at the end of the treadmill, we're going to ask you to test your strength on this object here. This is a hand dynamometer, and it measures actual physical strength.
12 Scottish volunteers from the Glasgow and Strathclyde University Officer Training Corps would each carry out the same test 3 times, with 3 different soundtracks played in random order. Bagpipe music, modern music, chosen to be at the same pitch and depth as the pipes, and, as a control, sound of silence.
Essentially, we're looking at if when pipers were in the battlefield and there were all these men who were exhausted, what was it about the pipes music that could drive them on? Could pipes music drive them on? And we'll see if this kind of motivation can make a genuine, objective difference to how much strength they can manage after being partially exhausted. 66.1. Okay?
Clinical trials have suggested that music can produce a marked physiological effect.
Probably the most famous of those concerns the effect of music on patients who have chronic obstructive pulmonary disorders. If you give them music, they report lower levels of distress and pain, but they also show higher levels of work output. That's very good. But here what we're looking for is a much more territorial effect. That is, will music, just because it's Scottish music and motivational music, have an effect? That's 34.2. Yep, bigger.
The next day, and Dr. Witchell has analysed the results of his experiment.
What we found was that the bagpipe music caused grip strength to be stronger than the alternative music, and that was statistically significant.
Overall, Dr. Witchell's study showed that the effect of the bagpipe music was inconsistent, but it was certainly noticeable.
It supports the idea that if these young people felt a sense of identity, felt a sense of social territory toward bagpipe music, it made them feel like Scots, it fits with the idea that this gave them extra strength, so that after this fatiguing exercise, that they found greater strength to do physical performance in a situation where they wouldn't necessarily have other found that strength. It gave them psychological reserve and resolve. But in terms of the structural components of bagpipe music, you've got two things going on. One is this high-pitched sound, the melody that gets you up, and if you identified with it, it would be strengthening rather than frightening. And the other thing is this drone, and the drone of the bagpipes is driving. It allows people to keep finding the strength to move forward. This drone is one of the most important things about what makes bagpipe music unmistakable, and you could imagine it being strengthening for the fighters in a war and terrifying for those who they're fighting against.
The raw power of the piper came at a considerable cost. At least 25 pipers killed at Gallipoli, about 50 at both Lewes and the Somme. The Scottish Army piper had come to life in a time of swords and muskets. But by the end of the Somme, by late 1916, pipers had spent over 2 years engaged in a very modern, mechanized war.
The game has changed. There is anecdotal evidence that they were protected. They were not always placed in the trenches except under the conditions of a major attack, kept further back because it's the problem of replacing them. And it would be a battalion commander's decision as to where he would want his pipers to be. Some were more protective of them than others.
Pipers would live or die according to the attitudes and philosophies of their commanding officers. Even as the war drew to its end, some battalions continued to place their pipers in the line of fire. Not least the foreign Scots. Scottish-styled regiments were raised on every continent, all proud of their history and lineage. Today, here in Vancouver and all around the world, the Army Piper remains a potent symbol of the bonds of clan and empire.
The pipes that I have were my grandfather's, Alexander Newlands. He got them issued to them in the First World War in 1914 when a member of the 48th Highlanders. And he was a pipe major. He was at Vimy and Ypres and Battle of the Somme and any of the major battles that were occurring wherever the 15th was stationed or deployed during that time, that's where they would have ended up.
Garth is himself a pipe major of the local Cedar Hills Caledonian Pipe Band, and he still plays the pipes his grandfather took to war.
My grandpa played them, and they have been in the family for 100 years now. Go ahead and try the bottom hand scale again. Much better. I can see my progression carrying on with them, and I'm instilling in my son the need to take up it as well. Good job, Austin. Yay. One more time. He will take on the pipes. He's going to have to wait a number of years before I'm ready to give them up.
100 years after his grandfather travelled from Canada to northern France, Garth Newlands has made that same journey. And with him, a precious cargo. Returning to France for the first time since the war, his grandfather's bagpipes. Born in Toronto, Pipe Major Alexander Newlands was the second son of an Edinburgh printer. He'd worked as a commercial artist. In 1914, and then a 24-year-old bachelor, Newlands joined the 48th Highlanders of Canada.
They came about through a guy called Alexander Fraser, who was the president of the Gaelic Society of Toronto. And he took it upon himself to say that Toronto needed to have an army regiment which showed military Scottishness. Montreal had one, and had one since 1882, and he kind of felt that they really needed to have their own, and then this was it. phenomenon which later spread throughout Canada. They came over to France. They still called themselves the 48th Highlanders, despite the fact that they were the 15th Battalion of the Canadian Expeditionary Force. So that Scottish identity, they wore the same tartan, they played the same pipe music, that still remained when they transferred into the Expeditionary Force and actually went to do serious fighting.
The Highlanders fought at Ypres, at the Somme, and in the spring of 1917, they came to Vimy Ridge. For 2.5 years, French and later British attempts to capture this elevated German strongpoint had failed. 4 Canadian divisions, 30,000 men would be the next to try. And so, just before 5:30 a.m. on Easter Monday, 1917, Garth's grandfather, Alexander Newlands, struck up his pipes and prepared for the charge.
The ground in front of him was a nightmare. It was mud, it was snowing, there was a horrible wind which was swirling around, and he would have been in front of his company of troops, piping them on, not responsible in an official way for getting them going, but he would have felt responsible for moving these guys forwards and taking the fight to the enemy.
Trying to think of what kind of courage that would have taken for a piper who step up over the edge of the trench and lead the soldiers into that battle is a scary thing to think about, because you're taking it in, or giving it into someone else's hands and hoping that you're going to be the one that's going to make it through.
Yep.
But you're also inspiring everyone else to take that next step and be courageous and continue on.
I think tradition played an important role as well, especially with the Canadian pipers, because they established themselves at the Second Battle of Ypres in April 1915, and they really stood up. It was the Canadians' first major battle. He would have had this idea of, these are the pipers who have gone before me in my regiment. This is the standard to which I want to maintain myself. But then there's also this dual aspect of coming from the 48th Highlanders of Toronto. They were allied to the Gordon Highlanders in Scotland, and they adopted their traditions. All of these different traditions would have been spurring your grandfather along.
Just 35 minutes after the initial attack, the Canadians captured their first objective. And 40 minutes later, at 6:45 a.m., they began a second attack, advancing even deeper into the German lines.
At some point in time, I understand that my grandfather put down his pipes because the battle started to get heavy, and he ended up losing his pipes for 3 days here.
Once the troops got to where they were going, he joined in. He joined in fighting, and he would have had his sniper rifle, and he would have been picking off Germans as best he could.
The repeated Canadian advances took place in appalling conditions. Freezing temperatures and horizontal sleet. Back at the Glasgow School of Art, Michael Stedman and Paul Wilson have attempted to recreate how Garth's grandfather's pipes might have sounded that awful Easter morning.
Wind, rain, men's footsteps and distant conversation going on. Men are freezing cold. Some of them are praying based on what's going to happen.
They're under terrible duress. But I do think that the bagpipes provides a sense of your own identity, which is a necessary thing. I think you've got to do this for something, whether it be for your wife, your children, your family, your country, your cultural heritage. I think the bagpipes distill all of that into one emotion, which is just immensely powerful. And of course, for some of these men, it was the last sound that they heard.
really hard to put fully into words what he would have been thinking about what was going on and what his active part was being. And it's an emotional thing, I guess.
The Battle of Vimy Ridge would be remembered as a spectacular success. In 1922, the French government gifted the entire battlefield to the people of Canada. On that land was built the Canadian National Memorial, in memory of 60,000 Canadians killed in 4 years of fighting. And today, the memorial plays host to a very special, very personal tribute. The tune, Flowers of the Forest, was written as a tribute to the dead of the Battle of Flodden in 1513. 500 years on, it has become the official lament played by military pipers in remembrance of fallen comrades. "2,500 pipers had served in the Great War, and of that number, 600 were wounded, and 500 were killed. Garth's grandfather, Pipe Major Newlands, survived. And a century on, back at Vimy Ridge, the sound of his pipes again fills the air.
It's great, yeah, to bring him back. I know that my grandfather did play an important part of the war. As pipe major, as a piper, as a soldier. And I'm sure everyone can thank every soldier for that.